The night reeked of warning, a fetid scent in the air that gripped the soul with a cold, unseen hand. Long before the first bell tolled, Edinburgh felt it a suffocating pressure, like the very city was holding its breath. The year was 1767, and Halloween had arrived, not with merriment, but with a chill that sank deep into the bones. The air was too still, as if nature itself had gone silent in fear. The fog clung to the streets like a shroud, the mist so thick you could barely see the kirkyard walls where the crows usually roosted. But that night, they had gone still, not a single beat of their wings, not a sound of their caws. Hours before the dark, even they had known something was wrong. As midnight neared, the streets lay empty beneath the weight of something unseen, something pressing in from all sides. The lamplights flickered as though afraid to burn too brightly, and in the distance a lone dog howled, its voice broken by the wind. Then one solitary chime rang from Street Giles, low, heavy. It rumbled through the streets like thunder trapped in a tomb, rolling over the closes, and winds with a force that made the very ground tremble. The sound was wrong, unnatural. Windows rattled, horses screamed in their stalls, bucking against invisible chains. The bells were not meant to ring that night. The ropes had been locked down, secured tight, but still the bell tolled. And then another followed, and another, until each tower in Edinburgh had answered, the tolls growing nearer, as though something was creeping closer with each passing second. If you're hearing this now, listen carefully. Turn down the lights, shut the doors tight. Tell me where you are listening from, what room, what hour, because once the bells start, there is no place left untouched, no corner safe from what comes next. That Halloween of 1767 would not be remembered for its revelry or its ghost stories, but for the sound that shattered the past possible friesformensane stillness. Carried through the fog and beyond the walls, 3 midnight bells tolling in unison, each one a harbinger of doom, a doom that would claim them all. No one would escape. The wind died without warning. One moment, the chimneys of Edinburgh moaned like organ pipes. The next, silence rolled in from the Firth of Forth, heavy and complete. The city froze beneath it. Candles shivered, door hinges sighed, and somewhere above the dark, tangled winds, a faint mist began to unfurl, slow and deliberate, like breath escaping the mouth of something vast. It was the eve of Halloween, 1767. The hour had not yet turned to midnight, but the air already felt wrong. The people who lived beneath the shadow of the castle sensed at first the uneasy kind of stillness that settles before disaster. The taverns along Cowgate were quieter than they had been in years. No laughter drifted through the shutters, no footsteps clattered over the cobbles. Even the rats that thrived on the city's refuse had vanished into the cracks. From the North Bridge to the Canongate, the air carried a strange smell, metallic, like the tang of iron mixed with smoke. Those who dared to speak of it later said it reminded them of burnt rope and wet stone, but few said much at all. The night demanded silence. Inside the old tenements, the poor huddled near their hearths, their eyes fixed on flames that burned too bright, as if fed by something unseen. Mothers whispered prayers over sleeping infants, tracing the sign of the cross against the doorframe. Old men muttered Gaelic words long forbidden by the kirk, and in the narrow alleys between the closes, a thin haze hung low, glimmering faintly whenever a lantern passed through it. Up on the castle hill, the wind stirred again, but only enough to push the fog against the walls. The sentries standing guard there swore later that the mist moved like water, sliding upward as if drawn by breath. Beneath their boots, the earth itself seemed to hum, not a sound exactly, but a pressure, a deep, resonant pulse that made their teeth ache. Down below, a seamstress working by candlelight felt the tremor through her table. Her needle slipped. A drop of blood bloomed on her finger, bright against the fabric. She turned toward the window, certain she'd heard someone whisper her name, but the street was empty. The fog had swallowed the lamps outside, leaving nothing but the dim outline of the spire of St. Giles against the cloudy sky. The first bell would not sound for another hour, yet already something vast and waiting had settled over the city. It lingered in the attics, in the vaults, in the hollow beneath every floorboard. The air felt charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. Those awake could feel their hearts beating in rhythm with the stillness, as though the city itself had joined them in dread. No one spoke of omens. No one dared. But every creature that breathed within Edinburgh that night, human or otherwise, felt it. The hush of an approaching storm that did not come from the sky. When the last candle flickered out on Grassmarket, the silence deepened until even time seemed to pause. The moon vanished behind the clouds. Somewhere, unseen, a rope creaked, and in that breathless darkness, the city waited for the first sound of the bells. The stillness had weight to it now, an invisible heaviness pressing against every wall and window of Edinburgh. The air inside the tenements felt close, as though the city had drawn a long breath and refused to let it go. The hearths hissed with damp wood. Somewhere, a clock ticked too loudly, and outside, in the winds between the closes, fog drifted low to the ground, thick enough to muffle the sound of footsteps. Those who were awake spoke in murmurs, afraid to disturb whatever had taken hold of the night. The bakers and lamplighters, the seamstresses and guards all went about their quiet duties with the sense that they were trespassing in their own city. Even the kirk bells, those hourly markers of life and labour, had fallen silent since 10 o'clock. Their absence was louder than their sound had ever been. On the Royal Mile, a stray dog whined and backed into a doorway, its hackles rising at something invisible moving through the mist. The few who saw it crossed themselves, whispering about the devil taking shapes again as he once did in the plague years. Across the way, an old man sat by his window, a candle guttering at his side. He was a veteran of the Jacobite rebellion and not easily frightened. Yet that night he kept glancing at the door as if expecting a knock from someone who had died long ago. Inside the homes of the Canongate merchants, curtains were drawn and locks turned twice. The wealthy had taken their superstitions from books instead of churches. Omens, astrology, whispered things from France. But they too felt the unease. A noblewoman at Holyrood Palace later wrote that she could not sleep, for she heard the city murmuring in its dreams. She thought it thunder at first, distant and soft, but no storm ever broke. Down in Cowgate, where the poor crowded close, the air grew colder by the minute. The fog seemed to seep through the cracks, curling around ankles and candle flames. The smell of smoke was stronger there, though no one could find its source. A boy selling coal swore he saw sparks fall from the sky like snow. His mother slapped him for lying, but she did not send him outside again. In the tavern called the Wound and Thistle, a half-dozen drinkers sat in silence, each staring at their reflection in the pewter of their mugs. When the wind brushed against the shutters, all of them looked up at once. No one spoke for a long time. Then one man, a sailor just home from Norway, said quietly that the air tonight felt like the sea before it breaks. No one laughed. Above them, on the ridge of the castle hill, the fog coiled thicker, lit now and again by the lanterns of the night watch. Their light did not travel far. It met the mist and folded inward, as though the city itself wished to hide what was coming. And then just before the hour, every flame in Edinburgh flickered once and steadied. The silence deepened, absolute and listening. Somewhere in the dark, a single drop of water struck stone. The next sound would be the first toll of the bell. Long before the bells began to toll, the first sign appeared beneath the castle itself. A faint column of smoke, rising through a crack in the cobbles behind the blacksmith's yard, twisting as though alive. The night watchman who saw it, one Andrew Kerr, a man too poor to fear ghosts, swore later that the smoke did not drift upward, but circled in place, coiling like breath trapped inside a bottle. He leaned close to inspect it, and felt the heat without seeing any flame. He called for another watchman, but by the time the man arrived, the smoke had thinned into the fog and left behind a smell no one could place. It was not of fire or coal, but something older, an odor of charred earth and damp parchment, like a book burned centuries ago but never quite gone to ash. The two men stamped at the ground, found it cool, and laughed uneasily. They did not speak again for the rest of the watch. Underneath the castle, unseen by all, lay the vaults, stone chambers carved out of volcanic rock, once used for storing arms and wine, now forgotten except by rats and thieves. The air down there was always stale, but that night it trembled faintly, as if something far below had shifted. A single ember glowed in the darkness, pulsing like a heart. Above, the great walls of Edinburgh Castle loomed through the fog, black against the colourless sky. The torches of the sentries sputtered and spat. One guard claimed to hear the sound of chains scraping far below his feet. Another thought he saw a thin trail of smoke curling up through a crack in the parade ground. None dared to open the hatches or shout alarm. The city had been restless all evening, and no one wished to be the one who named what was wrong. By 11 o'clock, the smell had reached the grass market. Vendors packing their stalls for the night wrinkled their noses, muttering about bad coal or a burst chimney. A woman carrying bread from the bakehouse crossed herself, whispering a psalm under her breath. She said the air burned her throat as she breathed. Inside a cellar on West Bow, a group of students from the university sat drinking and arguing about omens. One, a future minister, said the fog was God's warning for the sinful. Another, a physician's apprentice, insisted it was gas from the old wells. They went quiet when a small wisp of smoke drifted under the door and vanished into the rafters. The candlelight turned orange for a heartbeat, then pale again. None of them mentioned it afterward. Near midnight, the watchman Andrew Kerr returned to the spot where he had seen the smoke first rise. The street was empty now, the stones slick with dew. He knelt and touched the ground, cold as ever, but when he lifted his hand, his fingertips were blackened with soot. He wiped them on his coat, listening to the silence. Moments later, the first bell began to move. In a cramped garret above the closes of Candlemaker Row, a seamstress named Elspeth Dyer worked by the light of a single tallow candle. The wax had begun to pool at the base, soft and trembling, the flame bowing in and out as though breathing with her. Outside, the fog clung to the window panes so thickly that she could no longer see the opposite building. Only the faint glow of the candle made a halo against the glass, her reflection half merged with the night beyond. Her needle moved through linen with the steady rhythm of habit. She was finishing a mourning dress for a merchant's widow, a task she had done many times before. Yet tonight, her fingers felt clumsy, the thread catching more than it should. The silence pressed against her eardrums, louder than the clatter of any loom. Even the usual creaks of the old tenement, the sigh of the beams, the settling of floorboards had gone still. Then came the sound, a soft tread above her ceiling, deliberate and slow, like bare feet pacing across the boards. She froze, her needle suspended mid-air. There was no room above hers. The building ended in a roof of slate and soot. She waited, holding her breath, listening. The footsteps came again, 5 steps, then silence, then 3 more. She rose from her chair, the hem of her dress brushing the uneven floor, and lifted her candle toward the ceiling. "Who's there?" she whispered, but her voice seemed to vanish before reaching the rafters. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, all she could hear was her own breathing. Then, faintly, a single drop of water fell somewhere behind her, striking the basin near the window. The sound was soft but sharp enough to make her flinch. She turned, expecting to see a leak, but the ceiling beams were dry. The water in the basin rippled once, and then went still. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the glass, blotting out even the candle's reflection. Elspeth felt her skin prickle, the hairs on her arms rising. The air smelled faintly of iron, like a blood-stained pin. She took a step back toward the door, meaning to leave, but the floor groaned under her heel, and from above came a final heavy step, as though something or someone had shifted its weight directly over her. The candle flickered wildly. Its flame stretched tall, then shrank to a trembling blue point. For For an instant, the room filled with the scent of burnt fabric, and she thought she saw movement in the corner, a shadow bending the wrong way, darker than the rest. The light steadied, and it was gone. She sat back down, shaking, and forced herself to finish her stitches. Outside, the fog began to move again, swirling in patterns against the window. When she looked closely, it seemed to trace the outline of a hand. Far above, hidden within the smoke gathering under the castle hill, something ancient shifted awake, and below, in her small attic room, Elspeth Dyer realized she could still hear the faint rhythm of those unseen footsteps, matching the beat of her own heart as the hour crept closer to midnight. Dr. William Haldane was a man of reason, or so he told himself as he walked the cobbled winds with his lantern swaying before him. The fog was so thick it swallowed his light in arm's length, turning each step into a guess. He had been called to the home of a fevered child on West Bow, but when he arrived, the family's door stood open and the hearth cold. No sound came from within, only the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the house. He left the medicine by the door and told himself the family had fled to kin in Leith. Still, he lingered on the threshold, feeling the silence pressing out from the walls like breath. By the time he turned toward home, the city had gone entirely still. The lantern flame pulsed, dim and nervous, as if it too feared the dark. He could hear the echo of his boots on the stones, each strike returning slower than the last, as though the street itself was listening. Above him, the outlines of the old tenements leaned inward, black windows gaping like mouths. Somewhere distant, a door slammed once, sharp, final, and then nothing. He adjusted his cloak, muttering that the cold made fools of men. He had served in hospitals, dissected the dead, studied anatomy in candlelit rooms that stank of formaldehyde. Fear was for peasants and priests, not physicians. And yet when the lantern flickered again, revealing a second shadow beside his own, his body betrayed him. The light steadied, and the shadow was gone. Still, his pulse would not slow. Near the curve of Greyfriars, he noticed a movement, something low and pale sliding across the street ahead. He lifted the lantern higher. The flame cast a trembling ring of light over the fog. There was nothing there, only a glistening trail on the stones, as if something had been dragged across them. He followed it a few paces until it ended at the edge of a small courtyard, where the air felt colder, heavier. The smell reached him, first burnt cloth and wet earth, faint but distinct. He, crouched, touched the ground, and his fingers came away blackened with soot. As he straightened, the light from his lantern flared against a wall. For a split second, it caught what looked like eyes, 2 points of reflection, hovering in the mist at human height. He blinked, and the fog folded them away. His breath came out white and fast. Somewhere above, a sound stirred deep and resonant, like the faraway groan of metal under strain. He turned toward the castle, where the black shape of the ramparts rose into the fog. The lantern quivered again, casting halos through the smoke. In one of those flickers, he saw a figure standing halfway up the steps, a shape too still, too deliberate, cloaked in something darker than shadow. When he blinked, the steps were empty. Haldane ran. The lantern swung wildly, throwing splintered circles of light against the walls. Behind him, he thought he heard the slow rhythm of footsteps matching his own. He didn't stop until he reached his door on Lawnmarket. Inside, his wife woke to find him pale and shaking. He tried to speak but could only whisper 4 words before sleep took him. The smoke has eyes. And outside, far above the roofs of Edinburgh, a rope creaked in the dark. By the time the clock neared midnight, the fog had climbed the Royal Mile like a tide. Every shopfront and shuttered window along the high street was swallowed by it, until only the faint glow of lanterns near St. Giles Kirk remained, a few stubborn pockets of light trembling against the mist. The great church loomed over the square, its spire lost in the cloud, its doors bolted fast since the evening service. Yet those who passed along the close swore they heard movement within. The sacristan, old Thomas Greig, had made certain of the locks himself. He was a careful man, slow of step, but steady of hand. and he took pride in guarding the kirk's silence after dark. He had banked the candles, sealed the vestry, and whispered his nightly prayer to the empty pews before leaving. But as he made his way home through Parliament Close, a sound drifted from behind him, a dull thud, like the echo of something striking wood. He turned, peering through the fog. Nothing moved. The great doors stood sealed, the iron handles glinting faintly under the lamplight. He told himself it was the settling of old beams, the trick of wind against stone. Still, he lingered a moment longer, staring up at the dark crown of the spire. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a faint red shimmer behind the clock face, as though a light were burning deep inside the tower. Then the fog folded over it, and it was gone. Across the square, a young constable named Fraser was finishing his patrol. He paused when he saw Greg standing motionless before the church and called out to him. The old man didn't answer, only lifted a hand to his ear. Fraser listened too, and then he heard it. A sound that did not belong. A soft scraping, faint but distinct, coming from behind the kirk's heavy doors. It rose and fell, like rope drawn slowly through a ring. Fraser stepped forward, his boots ringing on the stones. The fog thickened around him until he could barely see the shape of the doors. The noise stopped. He reached out, laid his palm on the iron handle and froze. The metal was warm. Not just warm, but pulsing, as though something alive pressed from the other side. "Who's there?" he whispered. His voice sounded small in the dark. There was no answer. Only a low tremor ran through the wood beneath his hand, followed by 3 soft knocks from within. He stumbled back, heart hammering, but the fog offered no witness. When he turned to find Grieg, the sacristan was gone, his lantern lying on its side by the curb, still burning. Inside the church, unseen through the bolted doors, the bell ropes began to sway. Slowly at first, then with the rhythm of breath. The air thickened, the silence sharpened, and far below the floor, deep in the crypt where the dust of centuries slept, a single rope creaked tight, and in that instant, the waiting was over. The first bell stirred. It began with one note, low, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. It rolled through the fog like thunder trapped beneath the stones. Every window along the high street shivered in its frame. Dogs whimpered and hid beneath tables. Those awake felt it not only in their ears but in their bones, as if the sound had reached inside their bodies to test the rhythm of their hearts. The first toll of Street Giles's bell should have echoed cleanly through the night, rising and fading as always. But this one did not fade. It lingered, stretched, warped the air around it until time itself seemed to falter. The city held still, listening. The fog trembled, pulsing in rhythm with each vibration. Somewhere, far away, another bell answered from Greyfriars, or perhaps from nowhere at all. In a tenement on Fish Market Close, a family sat up in bed, clutching each other as plaster rained from the ceiling. The father cursed, saying the bell tower must be collapsing, but when the second toll came, stronger, lower, carrying with it a strange metallic harmony, he went quiet. The child in his arms began to cry without sound, its mouth open, no breath coming. Only after the echo subsided did the boy gasp again, as though the air had forgotten how to move. Across the city, shutters burst open. Men and women leaned out, trying to see through the mist. They could not tell where the sound came from. It seemed to roll from all directions, rising from the ground, falling from the sky. Even those half a mile away on Carlton Hill heard it clearly, though no wind should have carried it so far. Witnesses swore later that the sound was not like a bell at all, but like a human voice humming through iron. At the watch-post near the toll booth, Constable Fraser fell to his knees. The cobblestones beneath him quivered as if alive. He pressed his palms flat against them and felt the vibration pass upward through his arms into his chest. He thought of the warmth on the church doors, the unseen presence behind them, and suddenly he understood that this sound was not merely being heard, it was being spoken through the city itself. The third toll struck, and the world seemed to twist. Lantern glass shattered in its frames. Flocks of crows rose from the kirkyards in silence, their wings cutting through the fog like black knives. The air rippled, distorted, and for a moment everything shimmered: the spire, the rooftops, even the moon bending slightly out of shape before righting itself again. In the attic above Candlemaker Row, Elspeth Dyer dropped her sewing needle. The echo that followed was unlike any she'd ever heard, a slow vibration that crawled along the rafters and made the candlelight dance. The flame stretched tall, then bowed low, as though in reverence. Then, at last, the tolling stopped. The city hung suspended in silence, deafened by what it had just heard. The air seemed thinner now, as if something vast had passed through it and left nothing behind but its absence. For a heartbeat, all of Edinburgh stood still before the second church began to answer. The first bell of St. Giles had barely faded when another voice joined it, this one from the south, from within the stone walls of Greyfriars Kirkyard. The tone was higher, raw, and it did not ring so much as wail. It cut through the fog like a blade through cloth. The two sounds met somewhere over the rooftops and twisted together, one deep and measured, the other wild and uneven, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with unease. The kirkyard lay shrouded in a mist so dense it hid the headstones even from a few paces away. The gates had been locked since sunset, but when the first toll reached it, the iron latch snapped open with a sound too loud for metal alone. The gate swung inward on its own, and the fog poured through, rolling over the graves like smoke. Inside, a sexton named Patrick Forbes had been keeping the grounds against vagrants. He was a man who feared neither ghost nor sermon, a veteran of too many plague burials to flinch at darkness. But when he heard the cry of the bell, he dropped his lantern into the grass. It sputtered out at once. The light vanished as though swallowed by something waiting for it. He stood very still, listening. The wailing tone shivered across the stones, rising and falling in strange intervals, 3 quick peals, then one long groan. The sound did not seem to come from the bell tower at all, but from beneath his feet. The earth itself hummed, faintly at first, then stronger, until the ground began to pulse under his boots like a living thing. Gravestones rattled. Dust lifted from their carvings. Forbes stumbled backward as one slab shifted slightly, just enough for the grass to crack around its base. He whispered a prayer in Gaelic, half forgotten from his youth, but the words faltered when the mist around him thickened and took shape. A figure seemed to form in it, vague, hooded, stooped as though someone long buried had risen to listen. Then came a sound unlike any bell or wind. It was a human voice, faint but clear, calling his name from somewhere deep below the soil. Patrick. Once, soft, then again, louder. The fog rippled outward with the word, touching every grave. He clapped his hands to his ears, but the voice spoke inside his skull now, muffled and wet, repeating his name until it became only breath. The ground gave a slow sigh, releasing a scent of iron and rot. Forbes fled, stumbling toward the open gate. Behind him, he thought he heard footsteps matching his pace, bare, slow, dragging through the dew. When he looked back, the fog had swallowed the entire yard. Those who lived near Greyfriars swore the second bell had not rung from any tower at all, for its rope was later found severed halfway down. Yet still, in that hour, the wailing had echoed through every alley of Edinburgh. It was said that the dead of Greyfriars had answered St. Giles, and that the city, once again, had drawn a single shared breath and waited for what would come next. Down in the Cowgate, where the air always smelled of smoke and ale, a woman named Moira Keddy kept the lanterns burning in her tavern long past midnight. The place was called the 3 Crowns, though most locals whispered it should have been the one that watches. It sat low under a soot-darkened arch, its signs swaying in the windless air, creaking like something alive. When the first bells began to toll, Moira had been wiping down her counter, her hands moving in slow circles over the wet wood. The sound reached her through the walls, deep at first, then sharp, as though the city's own heart had learned to beat again. The mugs on the shelf trembled. One fell and shattered, scattering foam that shimmered oddly in the candlelight before sinking into the floorboards. She looked toward the door, expecting a drunkard's fist or the city watch calling curfew, but there was nothing, only the fog pressing against the windows, thick as lard. A handful of patrons remained, a cobbler, 2 soldiers, and a fiddler too tired to play. None spoke for a long time. The bell's echo rolled over them like a wave, and with each toll, the flame of the hearth thinned and bowed until it burned blue. The fiddler crossed himself, muttering that it sounded like the devil hammering his anvil. The cobbler laughed nervously, but no sound came out, only a wheeze. Then, from somewhere outside the tavern, came another noise, a soft scuffing, a rustle, like fabric brushing against the door. Moira set down her rag and stepped closer. Through the glass pane she saw them, figures in long black cloaks, moving slowly through the mist, their heads bowed as if in prayer. There were at least 6 of them, maybe more, their outlines melting into the fog as they passed the tavern. No one else on the street. No horses, no guards. Just those silent shapes moving against the wind. Moira backed away, heart hammering, and the soldiers rose from their seats. "Procession," one whispered. But there were no processions on Halloween night, not since the plague years. The last one had ended with coffins. The cloaked figures stopped. One turned toward the tavern door, and though the window glass was misted, Moira swore she saw no face beneath the hood, only a hollow, dark as the space inside a bell. The figure lifted its hand, and the fog behind it shifted, parting like a curtain. For a brief, impossible moment, the street beyond looked endless, stretching away into darkness that was not the city at all. Moira screamed. The glass shattered outward, scattering in a glittering arc. The figures were gone. The fog flowed back in, filling the doorway like smoke from a forge. When the city watch arrived hours later, they found the tavern empty, the candles burned down to pools, and the floor damp as though a tide had passed through. Only one thing remained untouched, a single black ribbon tied neatly around the tavern's bell rope. Those who heard the tale in the following days said it wasn't a story, but a warning that when the bells of Edinburgh ring on their own, the cloaked ones walk again to count who's still awake. When the bells began to fall quiet again, the fog thinned just enough for the glow of candles to bloom through it. Hundreds of them, trembling like fireflies along Candlemaker's Row. The boy who saw them first was named Davy Ray, a thin lad of 12 with soot on his face and wax hardened to his sleeves. He worked for the chandlers, running errands, fetching tallow from barrels, carrying light through the dark for those who could pay. But that night, he was the only one still awake in the workshop. The bells had unsettled him. He kept telling himself it was only wind echoing through the spires, but the sound felt too close, like someone whispering against his ear. So he stayed at his bench, pouring wax into the last of the molds, pretending not to notice the faint vibration in the glass jars. The flame beside him quivered and leaned sideways, though no draught moved. Then, all at once, every candle in the room flared white. Davy gasped and dropped his ladle. For a heartbeat, the workshop was bright as noon, the air humming, the light bending strangely, almost alive. Then, as suddenly as it came, the brilliance vanished. Every wick went dark. Only the smell of scorched linen and something sweeter, like honey gone to rot, remained. He stood frozen in the pitch black, listening to his own breathing. Through the shutters came another light, faint, steady, moving down the row. He pressed his face to the window and wiped the condensation away. Outside, the street lamps were dying one by one, each fading in perfect rhythm. First the one by the well, then the one before the grocer's, then the one at the foot of the hill. He counted the intervals between them. Each extinguished lamp matched the beat of a distant, unseen bell. At the top of the street, the final lamp flickered and died. The darkness deepened until the fog glowed silver with reflected moonlight. In that pallid shimmer, Davy saw movement figures again, maybe 3 or 4 gliding past the dead lamps. They carried no torches, yet the air around them glimmered faintly, as if light followed them unwillingly. He wanted to run. But something, curiosity perhaps, or fear too deep to move, kept him still. The figures reached the door of the old tallow shop across the way, the one closed since the fire years before. They paused there, and Davy swore he saw one raise its hand to the sign that read Candlemaker and Son. The wooden letters began to smoke, blackening at the edges. Then, without sound, the figures melted back into the fog. Davy stumbled away from the window, heart slamming. Behind him, a single candle on the shelf sparked to life, though no flame touched it. The wick burned low and blue, casting just enough light for him to see what was written in soot across the work table. 10 rang. 2 remain. Outside, somewhere deep in the fog, another bell stirred, slow, uncertain, and very far away. It tolled once, and the wax in every mould cracked like bone. Constable Malcolm Fraser had not slept in 2 days. The fog had smothered the city since the first bell, and every hour brought another report, lights moving where no road should be, doors found open that had been locked the night before, and people vanishing without a sound. The watch was stretched thin across the winds, torches flickering weakly in the damp. Fraser's boots left no echo on the cobbles, as if the streets themselves refused to remember his passing. He was stationed that night at the North Bridge, where the darkness was thickest. Below him, the city fell away into mist so dense it might have been water. He could no longer see the Firth, nor the faint orange glow of Leith's lamps across it. Only the smell of salt and smoke rose from the unseen depths. He rubbed his eyes, wishing for dawn, though he already knew the sun would not come easily this time. Then he saw it movement on the bridge. At first, he thought it was a man approaching, his outline faint in the fog. The figure walked slowly, shoulders hunched, steps steady. Fraser raised his lantern. "Halt there," he called. "Curfew's been struck." The man did not answer. He moved closer, his face obscured by a wide hat and the fog itself, which seemed to cling to him like cloth. The light from Fraser's lantern refused to touch him. "Name yourself," Fraser tried again, voice breaking slightly. The figure stopped. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, without sound, the man turned away and began walking not back the way he had come, but toward the edge of the bridge, where there were no railings. Fraser's blood ran cold. "Stop!" he shouted, running forward, the light swinging wildly before him. But when he reached the spot, there was no one, only wet stone, slick beneath his boots, and the thick white fog spilling endlessly below. He leaned over the edge, straining to see, but there was nothing to see, no splash, no scream, no body falling into the abyss. His hand shook as he held the lantern out. The light caught on something etched into the bridge's stone, a fresh mark, still wet. It was a circle crossed with 3 lines, carved deep, almost gouged. He touched it. The stone pulsed faintly beneath his fingers, warm like living skin. A voice called his name. He turned quickly, expecting another watchman, but the bridge behind him was empty. The fog had thickened again, folding in on itself. Then the voice came again, his own voice, perfectly mimicked, calling Fraser in the same tone, the same pitch. It came from the far end of the bridge, where a faint glow now hovered in the air, the same color as the church bell's reflection. He took one cautious step backward, then another. His lantern flickered once and went out. When the morning patrol found his cap and his truncheon lying at the bridge's center, there was no sign of Fraser. The stone where he had stood was dry, untouched by dew, as though the fog had refused to touch it. And those who crossed that bridge in the years that followed swore they could still hear his boots pacing there, forever walking toward a man who was never truly there. Before the bells began their dreadful duet, a sailor had come home to Leith from a voyage north, his name recorded later as Andrew Mallon. His ship, the Providence, had docked that afternoon, but the crew disembarked uneasy. They spoke little of what they had seen off the Orkney's lights under the water, moving against the current, and a low hum that rose from the sea itself each night after sunset. The others spent their pay quickly and vanished into taverns. Mallon, however, took the high road back toward Edinburgh, anxious to reach his wife and son before the All Hallows chill deepened. The mist rolled in long before he reached the city. It gathered around his boots and climbed until he could no longer see the road, only the faint glow of his lantern. By the time he passed Calton Hill, he realized he could hear the bells, though he was still miles from the kirk. They sounded far too close, two tones, one low and solemn, the other keening like a woman's voice. He stopped, turning toward the sea behind him, and saw nothing but white. When he reached his home on the edge of Leith Wynd, the front door hung ajar. His first thought was thieves. He pushed it open, calling for his wife. No answer came. The fire in the hearth burned low but steady, a pot of broth bubbling untouched beside it. On the table lay 2 plates, and a loaf of bread sliced neatly down the middle, the knife still standing upright in the crust. He climbed the narrow stairs, every step creaking like the sigh of an old ship. In the bedroom, the bedclothes were drawn back, but no one lay there. The window shutters were open, the night fog spilling in, pooling against the floor like breath. On the windowsill, he found a wet footprint, small, bare, and pointed toward the sea. He rushed back outside, calling their names, his voice swallowed by the fog. From somewhere behind the winds came a faint humming, almost musical, the same tone he'd heard at sea. The sound grew clearer, rising and falling, like the tide. He followed it to the edge of the harbour, where the water gleamed silver under the shrouded moon. At the end of the pier stood a woman, motionless, her hair black against the mist. He thought it was his wife. "Annie?" he called softly. The woman turned. Her face was pale and shining, not wet with sea spray but with light. Her eyes were closed, her mouth open as if she were listening to something distant. The humming deepened, coming not from her throat but from the water around her feet. Malin stepped closer, the boards groaning beneath him. "Annie," he whispered again. Her eyes opened black, endless, without a glint of reflection, and the humming stopped. For one breathless instant, the harbour went perfectly still. Then came the third bell. It rolled across the water, and with it, the woman vanished, leaving only ripples in her place. When dawn came, the door to Milan's house was found wide open, the hearth cold. On the wall above the bed, drawn in a finger's width of soot, were the words, "She heard them first." By the time the third bell faded into the fog, the water of Leith had begun to stir. No rain had fallen, no wind blew, yet the river swelled as though drawn upward by unseen hands. The fishermen who lived along its banks would later swear that it had not risen like water at all, but like breath, slow, deliberate, expanding with each toll from the city above. At the mill near Dean village, an old worker named Angus Kerr was the first to see it. He had returned to check the sluice gates before dawn, carrying a lantern that threw weak rings of light on the mist. The air smelled strange, sweet and metallic, like wine turned sour. He paused on the wooden bridge, looking down at the current below. The water was too smooth, too still. Then it began to move, not flowing forward, but heaving upward in a long, soundless swell. He took a step back, his boots slick on the boards. "It's the tide," he muttered, though he knew the sea was miles away. Beneath the bridge, something dark rolled just under the surface, something that caught the faint gleam of the lantern and reflected it back in a dull, copper shimmer. He leaned closer. The reflection rippled, breaking into dozens of small points of light, each glowing faintly like embers under glass. They weren't reflections at all. They were eyes. The river exhaled. A mist rose from it, thick and cold, and the lantern flame shrank to a trembling blue spark. The current reversed, pulling hard toward the city, as if the water itself had changed its mind about which way to flow. The noise of it was soft at first, like whispering hundreds of voices moving under the surface, their tones rising and falling in time with the distant bells. By the time Kerr stumbled back to the mill, the flood had reached the first wheel. The paddles groaned as the water struck them, though no debris followed, no branches, no foam, nothing but that smooth, unnatural tide. The other workers who came at dawn found the place empty, his lantern, floating near the bridge, still lit. The air smelled faintly of candle wax and salt. Upstream, near the village of Stockbridge, the river carried its strange calm past sleeping houses and shuttered inns. The dogs that barked at everything fell silent as it passed. By sunrise, the flood had reached the lower winds of Edinburgh, seeping quietly into drains and cellars, leaving behind a thin residue of black silt that glittered when touched by light. When the townsfolk woke, they found the wells running warm and the river water thick as oil. Women who went to fill their pails came back whispering that they'd seen shapes moving in the reflection faces where their own should have been. One child pointed to the ripples and said, "They're climbing." And indeed, by the time the fourth bell began to toll, the mist had reached the bridges again, curling upward in ghostly fingers. The water of Leith rose once more, not to flood, but to listen, carrying with it the echo of the bells, as if the river itself were trying to remember who had rung them first. On the south side of the city, where the fog hung low and thick over the meadows, a midwife named Agnes Murdoch sat waiting beside a dying fire. She had delivered 37 children in her lifetime, most of them in that very quarter of Edinburgh. But none had come into the world under a night like this one. The bells had shaken the air for hours, and though they had fallen silent now, their echoes still seemed to hum faintly through the walls. Even the baby she waited for seemed to feel it. The mother had labored for 2 days, and still the child refused to arrive. The house was small, its roof sagging, its windows fogged with soot. The mother, a girl no older than 20, lay pale on the cot, whispering a single word over and over through cracked lips. "Soon." Agnes tried to hush her, but the girl's eyes had rolled back, fixed on the ceiling as if seeing something neither of them should. Outside, a distant murmur drifted from the direction of the kirkyard voices chanting, perhaps, or wind scraping through the stones. Agnes told herself it was only drunks. Still, she barred the door and fed another stick to the fire, though the flames refused to rise higher than her thumb. When the girl's cry broke through the stillness, the room seemed to tighten. The candlelight dimmed. The air took on a weight, pressing down from above as though the very roof had lowered. Agnes bent to her task, murmuring prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. The infant came quietly, too quietly. No wail, no motion, just a slick weight in her hands and the awful stillness that followed. She rubbed the child's back, whispered its name, the one the mother had chosen, Isla, but the baby did not stir. Agnes was about to reach for her scissors when a sound rose from deep within the newborn's chest. Not a cry, but a hum. Low at first, then clear, eerily familiar. It was the pitch of the bells. Her hands trembled. She pressed her ear close, thinking she was mad, but the sound continued, steady and measured. The infant's chest pulsed faintly with each note, as if her tiny ribs were hollow and full of wind. Agnes looked to the mother, but the girl was motionless, her lips parted, her eyes wide. The hum deepened. The flame in the candle swayed sideways, and the shadows on the wall began to move, not flicker, but turn, like figures spinning in a slow dance. The sound grew louder until the wooden spoon on the table vibrated. Agnes backed away, clutching the child against her chest. The humming stopped. For one terrible second, silence swallowed the room whole. Then the infant's eyes opened grey, unfocused, yet knowing. She exhaled, a breath colder than winter, and whispered something that was not quite language, a sound like rope dragged across stone. By dawn, both the mother and child were gone. The midwife's fire had burned itself out. On the floor where the cot had stood, someone had drawn a ring in ash, perfect, unbroken, and still faintly warm. And in the distance, faint and patient, a bell began to toll again, as if marking a birth that should never have been. On the upper floor of a house overlooking the grass market, a merchant named Robert Calder struggled with a window that refused to close. The hinges were sound, the frame strong, yet the sash would not move. He'd pushed it until the glass rattled, tugged the latch until it bent, but the pane remained half open, letting in the cold mist that crept along the floor like smoke. His wife had taken the children to her sister's house beyond the walls. She said the city felt wrong since the bells began. Calder had laughed at her then. He was not laughing now. The fog outside pulsed faintly, its milky light flickering as though a hidden fire moved behind it. From below came no sound, no cartwheels, no hoofbeats, no laughter from the taverns. Even the beggars beneath the gallows had gone. The city, so full of noise and quarrel by day, had become as still as a painting. The only sound was the window's soft, rhythmic tapping as the wind, if it was wind, breathed against it. He fetched a hammer, muttering that no spectre would rob him of warmth. The iron head struck wood, once, twice, and then stopped mid-swing. The tool hung in his hand, frozen, his muscles refusing to move. A faint vibration travelled up his arm, like the thrum of a plucked string. The pane before him trembled. Then the frost on the glass began to melt from the centre outward, as though something on the other side pressed against it with great heat. Calder stepped back. The hammer fell to the floor with a dull thud. Beneath the thinning frost, an imprint formed 5 fingertips, clear as if made by flesh. The window pane bulged slightly inward. He could see no shape beyond, only the endless whiteness of the fog. And yet, when he leaned closer, a darker outline began to form. A face, blurred but human, with hollow eyes that seemed to blink from inside the glass itself. He stumbled backward, heart pounding, the air thickening around him. The candle on the desk guttered, shrinking to a blue point. The tapping began again, soft, insistent, no longer random. It came in groups of 3, a pause, then 3 again. The rhythm matched the bells that had shaken the city hours before. Driven by a kind of terror that feels like duty, Calder whispered a prayer and lunged forward, slamming the shutter with all his strength. The impact echoed through the room. The latch finally caught. He stepped back, trembling. The glass held. The fog beyond settled. He laughed weakly, then louder, the relief sharp and foolish. But as he turned to leave, a sound rose behind him, a thin hairline crack winding through the glass like lightning. He froze. Another followed, and another, each splitting outward from the center. The shutters shuddered violently, the latch bending in its clasp. With a final brittle sigh, the window burst outward. A rush of cold air filled the room, carrying with it a whisper that brushed against his ear 3 words, low and even: "We are inside." At dawn, neighbors found Calder's house empty. The shutters hung open, their edges rimed with frost. On the inner sill, traced delicately in the thawed condensation, were 5 fingerprints pressed from the inside out. The painter's name was Elias Brune, and he lived alone on a narrow lane off the high street, his small studio crowded with canvases that leaned like tombstones against the walls. He was not a man given to superstition. He believed in pigment and proportion, not spirits or bells. Yet in the night since Halloween began, he had found himself painting in fits, waking to see his hands already moving, brush gliding over canvas with a will not entirely his own. The first of these paintings was harmless enough, a street he knew well, the Royal Mile bathed in a grey, unnatural light. But when dawn came, the details changed. Figures had appeared along the edges, tall shapes without faces, drawn in the same steady strokes as his own work, though he had no memory of painting them. He locked the studio door that morning and swore off his craft for the night. Now, as the fog returned and the bells murmured again in the distance, Elias sat staring at the unfinished canvas in the center of the room. The lamplight gave everything a copper glow. His own shadow spilled across the floor, long and trembling. He was certain he had not moved the brush for hours, yet the image had grown while he watched. It showed the interior of his studio exactly as it stood, but the door in the painting was open, and someone stood just beyond it. He leaned closer, breath fogging the varnish. The figure was no trick of the light. It was tall, indistinct, the face hidden under the brim of a hat, but its posture matched his own perfectly. And though he sat still, he saw the figure's hand lift within the painted frame. Slowly, it began to reach toward him. Elias stumbled back, knocking over a stool. The brush rolled from the table. trailing black paint across the boards. He stared at the canvas. The hand had stopped halfway to the edge, as if waiting. He whispered, "Who are you?" And his own shadow, cast by the lamp behind him, moved before he did. It tilted its head. He froze, throat tight. The shadow on the wall did not mirror his stillness. It turned its shoulders, stepped forward, and laid one dark hand across the painted frame. The gesture was silent, graceful, almost tender. Then the canvas rippled, the surface bending inward like a curtain caught in wind. Elias lunged for the door, but the air had thickened. Each step felt like wading through tar. Behind him, the sound of bristles on canvas filled the room, slow and deliberate. He turned once. The figure in the painting had crossed the threshold entirely now, its black shape bleeding into the air, line by trembling line. He reached the door and pulled. It would not open. The knob turned freely, but the wood would not yield. The lamplight dimmed, flickered, and went out. In the dark, the sound of painting continued, brush dragging wetly across surface after surface. When neighbors entered the next morning, the studio was empty, the lamps cold. Only one new portrait hung on the wall. It showed Elias Brune standing beside his easel, smiling faintly, his brush raised mid-stroke. Behind him, his shadow was gone. When the bells finally ceased, the city did not exhale, it froze. The silence that followed was so thick, it felt almost physical, like a fog of its own. People who had covered their ears to escape the noise now kept their hands pressed there still, as if afraid of what they might hear in its absence. No wind moved, no cart rattled, no dogs barked. It was as if the whole of Edinburgh had been locked inside a glass dome. Down in the grass market, a group of night watchmen stood shoulder to shoulder, staring upward. Their torches hissed and guttered, the flames shrinking to small red points. They waited for the next toll that did not come. One man cleared his throat to speak, but no sound emerged. Another tried to stamp his foot. The noise was swallowed whole. Even the strike of metal on stone made no echo. The city had lost its voice. At Street, Giles, the bell ropes hung perfectly still, though the air around them seemed to quiver faintly, like heat above a forge. A single drop of water fell from the ceiling into the font below, and the ripple spread wider than it should have, trembling for a long moment before vanishing. The door stood ajar. No one remembered opening it. In tenements across the winds, people whispered in pantomime. Some clutched Bibles, mouthing verses. Others simply stared at their walls, waiting. Mothers tried to soothe children whose eyes were wide, but who made no sound when they cried. The absence of noise made everything unbearable, the scrape of cloth, the creak of the floor, the faint rush of blood inside one's own ears. It was as though the city had turned inward, listening to itself. A watchman named Duncan Boyd tried to ring his own handbell to signal the hour. The clapper struck metal, but nothing came out, no chime, not even a faint click. He stared at the instrument in horror, shaking it again and again. When the silence held, he hurled it into the street. It bounced once and rolled into the fog, vanishing without a sound. High above, on Castle Hill, the mist shimmered, pulsing faintly with pale light. The guards who stood there later swore that they felt the silence move an invisible wave that rolled over them like cold water. It pressed against their chests until they could scarcely breathe. Then, just as quickly, it lifted. Somewhere deep beneath the streets, down in the ancient vaults, something shifted, a long, slow scrape of stone against stone. Those who felt it thought it was thunder at first, but thunder has a sound, and this did not. It was more like a pulse, one that trembled through the bones, down into the teeth, through the heart. Then, faintly, a single breath stirred the stillness. No one knew where it came from. It was not wind, nor human voice, but something vast and patient drawing in air for the first time in centuries. And in that breath, the silence broke not with sound, but with knowing. Every person awake in Edinburgh understood, in some wordless way, that whatever the bells had summoned was now here, and listening. By the time the city dared to move again, the fog had grown thicker than before, no longer white, but grey and heavy, as though drawn up from the soil itself. The air was hard to breathe. It clung to skin, clotted in throats, tasted of burnt wood and old blood. Those who stepped outside said it wasn't mist at all, but smoke soft, oily smoke that drifted without wind, curling against walls and doors like something searching for a way in. It began near the cowgate, rising through the cracks between the stones. A baker on her way to stoke the morning ovens saw it first, a faint column rising from the gutter, smelling of tar and candle wax. She bent to touch it, thinking a coal had fallen from her cart, but when her fingers met it, the smoke split around her skin and slid away as though alive. She dropped her basket and ran. By dawn, it had reached the Royal Mile. It rolled low, hugging the cobbles, thin tendrils creeping through keyholes and cellar doors. Shopkeepers opened their shutters to find their floors veiled in a soft grey haze. Some swore they saw shapes inside it, human outlines forming and dissolving in the blink of an eye. Others spoke of faint whispers, words stretched too far to understand, like prayers spoken underwater. At Street, Giles, the smoke gathered thicker, swirling at the base of the spire where the first bell had tolled. The air shimmered faintly with a reddish hue, as though lit from within. A watchman who ventured too close said he felt the ground breathe beneath his feet. When he stumbled back, coughing, he found black soot on his hands, but it was warm, and when he wiped it away, it left no mark on his skin. Inside the kirkyard, the graves steamed. The frost that had held through the night melted away in seconds. The grass wilted, turning the color of ash. Birds lay dead against the fence, their feathers unburned but brittle, like paper singed by light. Down in the vaults beneath the city, the smoke moved differently. It flowed along, the old corridors like water returning to its source. The air there had been dead for generations, stale, thick, unmoving, but that morning it stirred again. The black walls gleamed as condensation slid down their faces, and the faint outline of a door appeared where none had been before, traced in a glow of dull red heat. A rat scurried past and froze mid-step. From the other side of that sealed wall came a noise, a slow exhalation, like lungs filling after too long a sleep. Above ground, the people of Edinburgh felt it too. The city seemed to shift, sighing in its foundations. Windows fogged from the inside. Chimneys began to smoke without fire. And when the first wind of morning finally stirred, it did not clear the fog. It carried it upward, spreading the smoke through every alley and close until the whole of Edinburgh shimmered beneath a thin veil of grey breath. Then the air went still again, waiting. And far below, something answered with another long, patient breath. When the smoke reached the Canongate, it slipped through the open doors of St. Mary's Chapel like a guest long expected. The caretaker, a gaunt man named Reverend Bellamy, had risen before dawn to prepare his Sunday sermon. He was not a fearful man. Years of tending to the dying had taught him to meet death with quiet eyes, but that morning his hands trembled as he lit the lamps. The smoke coiled around his ankles, and the flame of the first candle shrank to a thin blue thread. He told himself it was only damp, the city's breath finding its way indoors. But when he laid his notes upon the pulpit, he saw that the ink had run. The words he'd written the night before the same sermon he had preached, every All Hallows for 20 years, had blurred together into dark veins across the page. As he leaned closer, he realized they had not merely bled, they had changed. The lines curved into new shapes, letters twisting themselves into a language he did not know. Bellamy frowned and reached for his spectacles. When he looked again, he could read the words, but they were not his. The handwriting was rough, almost carved into the paper by a heavy hand. Each sentence ended the same way with a date, October the 31st, 1767. He turned a page, then another. The new text seemed to speak directly to him, describing a city of stone that held its breath, where sound bent and smoke remembered. The words pulsed faintly on the parchment, as if they had been written in embers instead of ink. One line made his throat tighten. The bells shall mark not death, but waking. Guard your tongue, for silence is the key that keeps the door asleep. His heart quickened. He looked up at the crucifix hanging over the altar and saw that the figure's eyes were open. Not glowing, not burning, just open, dull and human, and fixed upon him. He stumbled backward, the parchment scattering from his hands. The smoke thickened, climbing the steps to the pulpit. He thought to flee, but something unseen pressed against his chest, halting him mid-stride. The pages lifted from the floor, fluttering like wings, arranging themselves in the air before him. Each sheet caught fire without heat, the flames whispering softly. Through the crackle came a single word, repeated over and over in a dozen voices. "Listen." Bellamy fell to his knees. The fire consumed the papers, leaving no ash. Only a faint outline burned into the floor, a ring intersected by 3 lines, the same mark later found on the bridge where Constable Fraser vanished. When the congregation arrived that morning, they found the chapel doors open and the lamps burning low. The Reverend was gone. On the pulpit lay one remaining page, blank except for a single line scrawled at the bottom in his own hand. "The sermon has been spoken. Do not answer when the bells call." Outside, the city bells began again, faint, distant, impossibly deep, each note falling like a breath through smoke. When the bells began again that morning, they were softer, almost playful, like a lullaby carried on the wind. For a few brief moments, the city dared to believe the nightmare had passed. The fog thinned, the chimneys exhaled, and people stepped cautiously from their doors, squinting into the weak light. But down in Flesh Market Close, where the alley ran narrow and the sun never touched the stones, the sound was different. It wasn't music at all. It was laughter. At first it seemed to come from the butcher's shop at the end of the lane, small, quick giggles that bounced between the walls. The butcher, a heavy man named Fergus Dott, had left his stall shuttered since the bells first rang. But when he heard that laughter, something in it called him. He took up his apron, muttered about the foolishness of children out before church, and went to chase them off. The moment he lifted the latch, the smell hit him. Copper and tallow, sharp and sweet all at once. The air shimmered faintly, as if from heat. Inside, the tables gleamed as though freshly scrubbed, though he had not cleaned them in days. His knives hung in perfect order along the wall, but each blade was black at the edge, as if recently used on something that burned. Then came the sound again. Not outside now. Behind him, he turned slowly. The doorway stood empty, yet small footprints, bare, wet, impossibly clean, trailed across the floor. They led to the center of the room, then simply stopped. He bent down to look closer. The tiles were warm. As he knelt there, a shape flickered at the edge of his vision. The outline of a child, no taller than his counter, made entirely of smoke. It tilted its head at him. He froze. Another appeared beside it, and another, until there were 5, their faint grey forms pulsing in and out of visibility. They didn't move closer. They only watched him, their faces blurred and shifting as if the air itself were their skin. "Who's there?" he whispered. But the word came out cracked. One of the shapes lifted its hand, or what passed for one, and pointed toward the ceiling. Above them, the wooden beams began to creak. The laughter returned, echoing down through the boards, high and shrill. It came from the upper floor, where the smoke from the earlier nights had first seeped in. Dot reached for the stairs, his steps slow, his breath short. The air grew colder with each step. At the top landing, the sound stopped. The room beyond was empty save for a small bundle on the floor, wrapped in linen. He knelt beside it. It was a child's shift, soaked through and cold, though no rain had fallen. The fabric moved faintly, as if breathing. He stumbled backward, tripping down the stairs, crashing through the door and into the street. The laughter followed him halfway up the close, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. When the neighbors entered later, the shop was empty. Only the footprints remained, 5 small pairs burned faintly into the tiles, leading nowhere. And for weeks after, those living nearby swore they still heard giggles drifting through the smoke whenever the bells stirred the air. By the second night of the bells, the people of Edinburgh no longer slept. They sat by their fires, whispering prayers into the silence, afraid of what might answer. The fog pressed against windows and doors. like breath on glass. Even the rats in the winds had gone still, their usual scurrying replaced by the sound of something slower, dragging, deliberate, moving just beyond sight. In a narrow building off Nidri's Wynd, the tenants on the upper floor had taken to locking themselves in together. The youngest of them, a weaver named Elsie Tight, was the one who first heard the whispering. She had lain down near the hearth, listening to the crackle of coals, when she noticed the faintest sound, soft, rhythmic, like someone speaking through the door's keyhole. At first she thought it was the wind, but the tone was too measured, too intentional. She could not make out words, only the slow pulse of syllables, as if a stranger were murmuring her name over and over. She sat up, heart quickening, and crawled closer. The door stood firmly locked. The candle beside it trembled, its flame tilting toward the sound. She pressed her ear to the wood. What she heard then was neither voice nor breath. It was something in between, like the sigh of a tide retreating through teeth. Behind her, one of the men stirred. "What is it?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. She held up a hand for silence. The whispering had grown clearer, resolving now into something that might have been words, but not in any language she knew. It was slow, solemn, almost pleading. And every time she leaned closer, the voice stopped, as though aware of her listening. The others woke. A candle was lit. For a moment, the room brightened, the fear thinning like mist in sunlight. Then, as the flame steadied, the whisper came again, louder this time. It was not one voice but several, whispering at once, layered atop one another like overlapping breaths. The sound pressed through the keyhole, brushing the wood with an almost human warmth. The men rose. One fetched a poker from the hearth and jammed it through the hole. The whispering stopped immediately. The air went still. Then the poker began to move on its own. Slowly, it twisted, the iron bending with a soft groan, the metal reddening at the tip as if heated from the inside. They all stepped back, clutching each other. A moment later, the voice returned, not from the door this time, but from inside the room. It spoke from the walls, from the ceiling, from the air itself, low and close, its words spilling over one another in a chorus too dense to follow. The candles went out. By dawn, the door was found open. The tenants were gone, their chairs overturned, the ashes in the hearth cold. Only the key remained, still in the lock, its metal faintly warm. Those who tried the room afterward said that even in daylight, if you pressed your ear to that same keyhole, you could still hear the faint, overlapping whispers, each one softly calling your name. By the third night, Edinburgh no longer belonged to the living. The bells had begun again, not in rhythm now, not by the hour, but endlessly, without pause or pattern. Some tolled low and distant, others near enough to rattle crockery from the shelves. The city had become a vast instrument, struck by unseen hands, its sound carrying through walls, through bone, through dreams. Those who tried to flee found the gates sealed by fog. Those who prayed heard their own words answered by echo. At first, people tried to count the peals, to name which towers still rang. But no two agreed. A man on the high street swore he heard the bells of Greyfriars, while his wife insisted they came from the castle. Another claimed they rose from beneath the ground. No churchmen were left to explain. The priests had vanished from their parishes, leaving their vestments folded on the altars, their ink still wet upon unfinished sermons. In the heart of the city, the bell of St. Giles was the loudest. Each toll seemed to shake the air itself, bending it into ripples that warped the shapes of buildings and faces. Windows bowed outward, shadows stretched in impossible directions. People staggered under the pressure of the sound, covering their ears, yet still hearing it deep inside their skulls. One mother, desperate, stuffed wool into her baby's ears. The child screamed, then fell silent, its small body trembling in time with each peal. By midnight, the ringing had become constant, a solid wall of vibration that turned air to liquid. The streets shimmered as though submerged, the cobbles appeared to ripple underfoot, and every lamp burned a strange blood-orange hue. Some swore the light came not from the flame, but from the sound itself, as though each note carried its own dim fire. In a tavern on the Cowgate, a group of survivors huddled together, the noise pressed against the walls until the wood seemed to breathe. One man, a mason by trade, covered his face and began to laugh. "It's not the bells," he said hoarsely. "It's the city she's singing through her stones." None answered him. Outside, the air quaked. When the bells finally faltered, the silence that followed was worse. The air felt hollow, stretched thin. Then, from somewhere unseen, a single high note rang out, pure, piercing, the sound of metal at the breaking point. Every window in the tavern shattered at once. People fell to their knees, clutching their heads. The note did not end, it became steady, humming through every wall, every street, every chest. The fog thickened again, this time glowing faintly with that same red light. Those who looked into it swore they saw the silhouettes of bells suspended in the mist, dozens of them, swaying without ropes or towers. And then came the final peal, slow and vast, shaking the ground beneath the city. The people of Edinburgh understood then that the ringing would never truly stop. The sound had gone inward into the walls, the stone, the blood. Even when the air grew still, they could feel it beneath their feet, the heart of the city, tolling from within. When the last bell sank into silence, a new sound took its place, the slow, steady drip of water. Or at least, it seemed like water at first. Down in Parliament Close, where the air hung thick and grey, a clerk named James Muir stumbled from his lodgings, desperate for air. He had spent the night clutching his ears, convinced the bells were ringing inside his skull. The silence that followed felt worse, a hollow space that echoed with his own heartbeat. He leaned against the steps of Street Giles to steady himself, his hand brushing against something wet. The lantern he carried trembled in his grasp. The light fell across the stone, revealing dark streaks running down the stair in slow, uneven trails. He lifted his hand. His fingers were slick, not with rainwater, but with blood fresh, thick, and warm. The smell hit him next, iron and salt, sharp enough to sting the nose. He staggered backward, raising the lantern higher. The blood had spread across the steps like veins, branching outward from a point near the door. It wasn't pooled, nor spilled. It had grown, seeping up through the cracks in the stone, following the mortar lines like roots in search of light. The sight of it made his stomach twist. He turned to call for help, but his voice broke into a hoarse whisper. No one answered. From somewhere behind the church doors came a faint scraping. The same sound he'd heard nights before, the drag of something heavy against wood. He stepped closer, listening. The door shuddered once, then stilled. His lantern dimmed, the flame shrinking to a red thread. Then, from beneath the door, a small line of blood began to creep outward, slow and deliberate, winding its way toward him. Muir stumbled back, tripping on his coat. The lantern slipped from his hand and shattered, oil spreading across the stones. The flame caught instantly, flaring bright. For a brief, blinding moment, he saw what lay at the top of the steps. Bodies, or what had once been bodies. They were, draped against the door, their faces turned upward, mouths open as if still mid-prayer. Their hands were clasped together in unnatural poses, fingers interlocked too tightly, the skin torn at the knuckles. The firelight glistened on their eyes, each one open and glassy, reflecting the faint crimson shimmer that hung in the fog. Then the flame guttered and went out. Muir scrambled to his feet and ran. He did not stop until he reached the bottom of the wind, where he collapsed against the wall, shaking. When dawn came, the steps were clean, washed bare by a night wind no one else had felt. But the air still smelled faintly of iron, and the stone retained a dull red stain that no rain could scrub away. For years after, those who passed that place at night swore they could still hear the slow, sticky rhythm of droplets falling onto stone, like a clock marking the seconds left before the bells began again. In a narrow passage between the winds, where even the fog seemed to hesitate, there lived a cobbler named Thomas Veitch. He was a quiet man, known for working late into the night, his hammer tapping steady as a metronome. Since the bells had begun, however, he no longer sang to himself as he worked. His shop, once warm and full of lamplight, had grown dim and airless. The sound that used to comfort him now pressed against his ears, even in silence. The morning after the blood appeared on the church steps, Veitch found the air thick with soot. A faint layer of ash dusted his workbench, though the hearth was cold. He brushed it away and muttered that the city was rotting from the inside. Still, the work kept his mind busy. The boots on his bench belonged to a watchman Fraser, a good man who had vanished days earlier. Veitch had been meaning to return them, but had no heart to climb the bridge again. He bent over his stitching, the sound of the needle through leather sharp and clean. Beneath the rhythm, he heard something faint, a soft scraping under the floorboards. Mice, he thought, until it came again, slow and heavy, like a hand dragging across wood. He froze, listening. The sound moved beneath him, pacing the length of the room. Rats, he whispered, though he didn't believe it. He set down the boot and crouched beside the boards, pressing his ear against them. What he heard was not skittering, it was breathing, long, measured, as if the house itself drew breath. He rose too quickly, knocking over his lamp. Oil spilled across the floor, and the small flame jumped to it, flaring orange before dying in a hiss. Darkness swallowed the room. For a few moments, there was nothing, no sound but the faint, wet inhale beneath the boards. Then came a voice. "Thomas." He backed away, his heel striking the wall. The voice was low, muffled by the wood, but it carried his name with painful clarity. "Thomas," it said again, closer now, as though rising from the ground. He wanted to run, but the door refused to open. His hand on the latch felt heavy, his fingers numb. The boards beneath his feet groaned. The floor shifted, a seam split open between the planks, and something thin and pale reached through 5 fingers, slick and trembling, groping for air. They pressed against the boards, leaving damp prints that smoked faintly in the dark. Veitch stumbled backward into his bench, scattering nails and soles. The hand withdrew, and for a breathless moment all was still. Then came the hammering from beneath, not frantic, not wild, measured, steady, mimicking his own. Tap, tap, tap. The cobbler's tools began to rattle. His unfinished boots trembled where they Saturday. He tried to speak but found no sound. When the hammering finally stopped, so did he. When neighbors forced the door open the next morning, they found the shop empty, the bench untouched. Only the boots remained newly finished, polished, and standing side by side in the middle of the floor. Beneath them, on the boards, was a perfect handprint burned into the wood. The girl's name was Catriona Reed, though in the records that remain, she is only called the Child from the Mile. She was 9 years old and slept in a garret beneath the eaves of her grandmother's bookshop. Since the night the bells began, she had stopped speaking. She would sit at the top of the stairwell, head cocked, eyes half closed, counting under her breath. Her grandmother thought it was a game until she realized the counting always began when the fog thickened and ended just before the tolls. Catriona had a gift for sound. She could tell which footsteps belonged to which customer, could tell how far away a carriage was by the rhythm of its wheels. But what she heard now was different. It came from inside the walls, behind the shelves of books. A slow, hollow knock that echoed long after it should have stopped. Each time it came, she lifted a finger and whispered a number. On the night after the cobbler vanished, she sat awake long past the candle's end. The shop below was silent. The city outside had settled into its uneasy stillness. Then she heard it again, 1, 2, 3. A pattern of echoes that seemed to move through the very air. She rose from her cot, bare feet cold on the boards, and followed the sound. It led her down the stairs to the back of the shop, where a heavy case of theological texts stood against the wall. The air there felt strange, close, but not stale. The knocking continued, slower now, and deeper, as if something vast and patient were tapping from the other side of the stone. She pressed her ear against the spine of a book and heard it clearer. 4, 5, 6. Her grandmother called down to her, voice trembling. "Cat, leave it be. Come away now." But the girl didn't move. The voice behind the wall wasn't knocking anymore. It was humming a low tone that seemed to bend the room around it. The books shivered on their shelves, their pages rustling as though stirred by wind. The ink on the spines bled, faintly, curling into shapes that weren't letters. 7, the girl whispered. The humming rose in pitch, almost too high to hear. She clapped her hands over her ears, but the sound was inside her now, filling her chest. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was perfect, so heavy it made her knees shake. She turned to run back upstairs, then froze. From the darkness between two shelves, a soft voice counted 8. When her grandmother reached her, the girl was gone. The candle lay melted at her feet, the wax streaked in lines across the floor like tiny paths. On the wall behind the bookcase, the old woman found 8 black marks pressed into the plaster-perfect circles, each one slightly deeper than the last, as though something had been knocking from inside the stone. Later, those who lived nearby said they often heard the girls counting at dusk, always slow, always calm. The number never stopped at 8. It always reached 13, and then began again. Robert Dalrymple was a linen merchant of means, a man proud of his rational mind. He dismissed the talk of hauntings as hysteria. Bells that rang without hands, blood that seeped from stone. He told his wife it was all nerves and fog. Yet since the silence had returned, he'd begun to dread sleep. Each night, when he closed his eyes, a dream came always the same, always beginning with the same sound. It wasn't a bell this time, but a heartbeat, slow and vast, pulsing through the walls of his townhouse on Advocates Close. In the dream he stood at his window, watching the mist move through the wind. The air shimmered as though alive, and shapes drifted within it, figures he almost recognized. They didn't walk, they swayed, as if suspended by invisible cords. When he called to them, they turned their faces toward him, and every face was his own. He would wake with a start, drenched in sweat, his pulse racing. Each morning he tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was wine, or the strain of sleeplessness. But when he looked into the mirror to shave, he sometimes found a thin line of soot across his forehead, as if something had touched him while he dreamed. On the 3rd night, the dream changed. He stood again at the window, but the mist had cleared. The city lay silent beneath a blood-red dawn. From every tower hung a bell, but their clappers swung in slow circles, striking nothing. The silence was absolute, but the air throbbed with tension, as though the world were holding its breath. Then the bells began to move, not swinging but turning, their rims spinning like wheels. They spun faster and faster until they became rings of molten light, and from within each ring stepped a figure cloaked in smoke. Dalrymple tried to run, but his feet would not obey. He turned to find his wife beside him, still sleeping soundly. Her face glowed faintly in the red light, serene and unaware. When he reached to shake her, her eyes opened grey, distant, and not her own. "You shouldn't have listened," she said. The voice was not hers either. It was deeper, layered, as though many voices spoke through her at once. "You opened the window." He woke, gasping, the words echoing through his skull. His chamber was cold. The curtains fluttered, though the sash was shut. The candle on the bedside table had burned down to a pool, its wax dripping steadily onto the floor in perfect circles. The next morning the servants found him at his desk, asleep upright, his eyes half open. On the blotter before him was a page of his own hand, written in ink he did not remember touching. "The bells are not sound, they are sight. They show us what the city remembers." When they lifted him from the chair, his fingertips were black with soot. Outside his window, a fine layer of ash had settled overnight, though no fire had burned anywhere in Edinburgh. Far below the closes and winds, where the living seldom ventured, the vaults of Edinburgh stretched like veins through the rock. Most had been sealed for decades, storerooms, cellars, forgotten spaces walled up after the plagues. But some doors were never truly closed, and beneath the South Bridge, one remained open, its lock rusted through, its threshold marked with soot, that never washed away. The man who tended that place was known only as MacNab. By day, he swept the closes above and kept to himself. By night, he descended with his lantern, checking the tunnels for flooding or rats. It was lonely work, but he liked the quiet. The air down there was thick and cool, smelling of earth and stone, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a cloak, until the week of the bells. The first time he noticed the change, he thought it was echo. His own footsteps came back to him, a fraction late, softer, like another man walking just behind. Then came the whispers, faint, rhythmic, always ahead of him rather than behind. He told himself it was the sound of wind through cracks in the walls. But by the third night, when he passed the old wine vaults, the air seemed to hum. He stopped, raised his lantern. The flame stretched sideways, as though drawn toward the stones. He felt the pull, too, a low vibration under his boots, deep and regular, like breath rising through the ground. The wall itself appeared to shimmer. That was when he saw the outline of a door, not one he'd ever known, but traced faintly in soot across the brickwork. In the light, the soot glowed red, as if the pattern had been burned there. A circle crossed by 3 lines, the same mark that had begun to appear elsewhere in the city. MacNab's instincts told him to turn back, but curiosity was a stubborn thing. He pressed his palm against the wall. The stone was warm. It trembled once beneath his touch and then, slowly, soundlessly, began to open. A crack split down the center, revealing darkness beyond. Not the natural dark of tunnels, but a living black, thick as ink. From it came a smell that made his stomach clench. Damp iron and candle smoke. His lantern flickered, then steadied. Something was breathing on the other side. He leaned forward, calling out, "Who's there?" The answer came softly, from very near. "You are." The lantern flared bright, then burst, shattering in his hand. MacNab cried out, stumbling back, but the door had already vanished. The wall stood smooth again, cold and unmarked. His palm smoked faintly where he had touched it, the skin seared with the same symbol that had glowed on the stone. When his fellow sweepers found his body the next morning, he was lying across the threshold of the vaults, eyes open, mouth full of dust. The mark on his hand was still warm, and in the depths below, faint as a heartbeat, the sound of breathing continued steady, patient, endless. By the next evening, rain fell over Edinburgh, but it did not bring relief. It came down thick and slow, black as soot at first, then grey, leaving streaks on every window it touched. Those who opened their shutters said the rain smelled wrong. Not like the usual wet stone and smoke, but of something burned long ago, ashes soaked in oil, faintly sweet, faintly human. In the tenements along the high street, women gathered buckets beneath the leaks, but the water that filled them was dark and clotted, leaving oily sheens that shimmered faintly in candlelight. It hissed when poured into basins, as though the earth itself objected to its return. The gutters foamed, carrying the rain down toward the cowgate, where it pooled ankle-deep and refused to drain. A cooper named David Hume, no relation to the philosopher, as he often reminded people, was among the few who ventured out. He said the smell was driving him mad, and he would rather drown than breathe another hour of it. He waded through the slick alleys, pulling his coat tight, trying to tell himself that the dark rain was only the soot of 100 chimneys stirred by wind. But as he passed the churchyard, the odor sharpened hotter now, metallic, unmistakable, the smell of burning flesh. He stopped, clutching the wall for balance. The stones were warm beneath his hand. Steam rose from the cracks. When he lifted his palm, a faint black print remained there, perfectly round, as though the wall itself had branded him. He staggered back, heart pounding, and the ground beneath him trembled. The rain struck the street in heavy drops, each one landing with a hiss that left tiny puffs of smoke. Then came the sound, low and distant at first, like thunder. But it wasn't thunder. The sky flashed not white but red, illuminating the city for a single instant. Hume saw it clearly then. the rooftops glistening as though varnished, and from every chimney, smoke rising downward, sinking into the streets instead of up into the clouds. He turned and ran, splashing through the flooded wind. The rain stung his skin, and where it touched, it left faint grey marks, the colour of old cinders. When he reached his door, he slammed it behind him and collapsed, gasping. His wife, pale and trembling, held a candle near his face and whispered, "Look." He followed her gaze to the hearth. Though the fire had burned out hours ago, a thin trail of smoke still coiled from the ashes. It drifted upward, gathered at the ceiling, and began to turn in slow circles. The smell thickened until he gagged. The smoke folded inward on itself, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw faces forming within it, eyes half open, mouths moving soundlessly. Outside, the rain fell harder, the world hissing like a forge. The gutters overflowed, carrying with them a slurry of soot and something darker. By morning the rain would stop. The streets would gleam black and clean, as if scoured by fire. But those who woke early swore that the smell still lingered, ash, oil, and something sweeter. Something like the air inside a crematorium when the fire has only just gone out. When the rain ceased at last, the city looked reborn, washed clean, gleaming, almost peaceful. The air was sharp and cold, and for the first time in days, the bells were silent. People stepped cautiously from their homes, blinking into the weak, grey morning. The cobbles steamed, the gutters ran clear. Edinburgh exhaled, but peace never stays long in a city that has heard its own heartbeat. It began with the ribbons. At first, no one noticed them. A single strip of black silk, tied neatly to the door handle of a baker's shop on Candlemaker Row, another on the gate of Greyfriars Kirkyard, then dozens more, appearing as dawn bled into day on shutters, on lampposts, on every threshold where someone had gone missing since the first toll of the bells. They were not wet from the rain, not even damp. The fabric was cold to the touch, soft as skin, and faintly perfumed with something floral and wrong, like roses left too long in a sealed coffin. Those who found one assumed it a cruel prank. But by mid-morning the city's mood had turned again. The cobbler's shop, the butcher's, the tavern where Moira Keddy had vanished. Every door that had opened to the unknown now bore a ribbon, and when the constables tried to remove them, they found the knots would not loosen. The silk seemed to tighten instead, cutting into their gloves, drawing thin lines of black across their fingers that would not wash away. By afternoon, word had spread that the ribbons were multiplying. New ones appeared even as the watch tore down the old. A messenger swore he saw one knot itself before his eyes, the ends twisting like living things. And then there was the matter of the names. The apothecary's apprentice was the first to notice it. Beneath the bow of each ribbon, in thread finer than a spider's web, a name had been stitched, faint, grey, and nearly invisible, unless held to the light. Some were names of the vanished, others belonged to the living. One ribbon bore the name of Reverend Bellamy, whose sermon had burned away. Another, the name of young Catriona Reed, the girl who had counted the echoes. One was found tied to the handle of a carriage that had not moved in years, embroidered with the words, Thomas Veitch. And near the top of the Royal Mile, at the steps of Street Giles, a ribbon fluttered gently on the great church door. No name at all was stitched into it, only a single mark, the same circle crossed by 3 lines. By dusk the ribbons began to hum. A faint vibration trembled through their silk, low and even, like the breath of a sleeping throat. People shut their windows. The air thickened again. When darkness fell, the ribbons swayed without wind, every bow turning inward as if listening, and somewhere in the fog above the city, a sound stirred, soft at first, like the plucking of a string, then lower, slower, inevitable. The bells were waking again. When the ribbons appeared, the studio of Elias Brune remained sealed, its windows nailed shut by order of the watch. Yet those who passed along the close at night swore they saw light through the cracks. A pale, trembling glow that moved like breath behind the glass. Some claimed they could hear the sound of a brush dragging slowly over canvas. Others said they saw the shadow of a man who should have been gone. The constables ignored the gossip until the morning of November 2nd, when a new painting appeared in the window. No one had entered the room, and yet there it was, large, framed, its varnish still wet. The surface shimmered faintly, like oil on water. Word spread quickly, and by noon a small crowd had gathered below, staring upward in uneasy silence. The painting showed a street none of them could place. It might have been Edinburgh, but not as they knew it. The buildings leaned at wrong angles. The sky was too low, the light too red. A woman stood in the center, her face turned away. Behind her hung dozens of black ribbons, each tied to a bell that glowed faintly in the gloom. And there, half hidden in the doorway beside her, was a man, Elias Brune himself, his expression fixed in a soft, dreamlike smile. At sunset, the inspector ordered the window forced. The men who entered the studio returned pale and speechless. They found no artist, no easel, no palette, only the painting and a second one beside it, covered by a drop cloth. When they lifted the cloth, the smell of smoke filled the room. The second canvas was blank save for a single image, a black circle crossed by 3 grey lines, painted with the precision of a craftsman's compass. That night, the first painting changed. The woman turned. Her face was pale, her eyes open, and her mouth stretched into something that might have been a scream or a song. By morning, the crowd was gone. The constables posted to guard the building refused to stay after dark. When they returned at dawn, the painting in the window was gone. In its place hung a third. This one showed the same street again, but empty now, except for a single ribbon drifting mid-air, its ends curling toward the viewer as if reaching out. The background was darker, the sky nearly black. The color of the ribbon was not ink or pigment. It was deeper than that, matte and lightless, absorbing the glow around it. A scholar from the university was brought to examine it. He insisted it was no ordinary paint, that under magnification the surface seemed to pulse faintly, like living skin. When he touched it, the fabric of his glove discolored as though soaked in ink. That evening, the painting was moved to the church for safekeeping. But when they carried it through the closes, the bells began again, slow, soft, almost tender. Those who bore it swore they felt the canvas tremble in their hands. And behind them, in the sealed studio, a faint scraping began, the sound of a brush being cleaned in water that was not there. The city waited for daylight, but it never arrived. The eastern sky lightened briefly, an anemic grey glow that promised dawn, and then dimmed again, as though someone had drawn a curtain across the Sunday. The fog thickened once more, swallowing the rooftops. The air grew colder, heavier. Even the birds, which had returned for one short morning, were gone. At first, people blamed the weather. They lit candles, trimmed wicks, prayed for wind. But by mid-morning the light had not changed. The clocks ticked, yet time itself seemed to have slowed. Children fell asleep at their desks. Bakers swore their dough refused to rise. A physician claimed his shadow had not moved since sunrise. And at the tolling of the unseen hour no one knew which the bells began again, so faintly that they might have been imagined. At the castle, soldiers stood on the battlements, staring eastward toward the invisible sea. The fog shimmered faintly with a dull orange pulse that came and went in rhythm with the bells. One soldier raised his musket and fired into the haze, just to prove the world was still real. The sound was devoured whole, leaving only the echo of the trigger's click. Moments later, the fog rippled outward from the place where the bullet had vanished, as though the air itself had swallowed and exhaled. Down in the winds, the people began to whisper that the day had not come because the city no longer needed it. The fires in the hearths burned low but never went out. They smoldered endlessly, consuming nothing. Lamps flickered without oil. The water in the wells stood black and still, reflecting nothing. A midwife crossing the grass market felt her heart falter when she looked up at the clouds. They weren't clouds at all, she realized, but smoke rising downward from above, a ceiling of soot that pressed the daylight into submission. Beneath it, the air glowed faintly, as though lit from within by embers. In the kirkyard, the tombstones steamed, their inscriptions softened in the moisture, the carved letters bleeding downward until they resembled melted wax. When the sexton tried to wipe one clean, his rag came away smeared with black residue. The stone beneath his hand was warm. By afternoon, a strange calm overtook the city. Those who still moved did so quietly, as if walking through a church during prayer. The fog muffled everything, the tread of boots, the sob of a child, the ringing of metal on cobble. Only the bells persisted, faint and uneven, as though tolling from far below the earth. At what should have been dusk, the light dimmed further, turning copper, then red. The bells faltered once, twice, and went silent again. A merchant on the Royal Mile raised his eyes to the sky and saw movement, vast shapes gliding within the smoke, slow and graceful, circling as though keeping watch. The sound that followed was not thunder, not wind, but a single drawn-out note, deep enough to shake the teeth in his skull. Then the color drained from the world entirely. The hour that should have been night arrived, but the sun had never risen. It was, as the survivors later said, the morning that refused to come and the day that forgot to end. By the second day without daylight, the city began to turn inward. The fog pressed closer now, thick as wool, muting every voice to a whisper. With the watch scattered and the bells tolling from nowhere, those who still clung to reason sought refuge where the walls were thickest and the doors could be barred. They gathered at the old toll booth by Street Giles, that narrow fortress of stone that had once served as prison, court, and council hall all in one. A handful of merchants, clerks, and churchmen stumbled there through the murk, their lanterns glowing weakly like dying embers. They spoke little. No one wished to name what was happening. Every word seemed to make the fog stir. Inside, they found the hall as they had left it the week before, benches overturned, candles burned down to wax stubs, a faint smell of iron in the air. They bolted the doors and tried to feel safe. The oldest among them, a magistrate named Sir Alastair Grant, declared that the city's survival depended on order. "Whatever this is," he said, "it will end when we restore law to the streets." But even as he spoke, the walls of the hall seemed to hum faintly, vibrating with the echo of some distant tone. The magistrate fell silent, his voice drowned by silence itself. They lit new candles. The flame wavered, though no draught moved. A clerk began to write an account of the last 3 days, but the ink ran thin, refusing to dry on the parchment. Another man, trembling, claimed he saw movement beyond the leaded windows, shapes gliding through the fog, circling the building like wolves around a pen. Then the bell above the toll booth tower began to move. No one had touched its rope. The first peal was soft, almost human, a sigh of metal bending. The second came stronger, shaking dust from the beams. The third split the silence open. The sound rolled through the stone floor like a heartbeat, deep and steady. The crowd looked to the magistrate. His lips moved, but his words made no sound. He turned toward the doorway leading to the tower stair. A faint orange glow leaked through the cracks of the wood. Someone whispered a prayer. Another reached for the bolt, but it was hot to the touch. From behind the door came a murmur, low at first, then clear. It was a voice, or several voices speaking together, reciting words too old to understand. The glow brightened, pulsing in rhythm with the chant. The bell rang again, louder this time, so loud that the glass panes quivered and the candles leaned sideways. The magistrate took one step toward the door. The others begged him to stop, but he lifted the latch. A rush of air burst through, cold and black, snuffing every candle in the room. The bell tolled once more, then stopped. When the light returned, the magistrate was gone. The door stood wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. Beyond it, the stairway climbed into darkness, lit faintly by a glow that seemed to breathe. And on the stone floor where he had stood lay a single object, a judge's gavel, still warm, its handle stained red as if it had been dipped in embers. When the magistrate vanished from the toll booth, word spread like fever through the city, or what remained of it. Few dared speak aloud now, for every echo returned, changed. But one man, driven by faith or madness, insisted that the answer had already been written. His name was Father James Calder, a curate from the Canongate who had served under the vanished Reverend Bellamy. He claimed his old master had left behind a final sermon, one never meant to be read. The manuscript was said to lie hidden in the vestry of St. Mary's, sealed in a wooden chest behind the altar. Calder swore that Bellamy had written it in the last hours before the bells began to ring of their own accord, that it contained the reason for the city's torment and the name of the thing that slept beneath it. Against the pleas of the few parishioners still alive, he set out through the fog to find it. He walked by lamplight through streets empty as graves. The fog glowed faintly red, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Every door he passed bore a black ribbon. Every window reflected his face instead of the room behind it. When he reached the chapel, its doors were already ajar, swinging gently as though stirred by breath. Inside, the air was thick and dry. The candles had melted into long, twisted shapes, their wicks unburned. He found the chest easily. It waited for him, half buried in dust. The lock was warm to the touch. When he broke it open, the smell of ash and wax rolled out. Inside lay a single stack of pages, bound with black thread. The top sheet bore one line in Bellamy's hand. To speak is to summon, to write is to remember. Calder turned the next page. The ink shimmered faintly, as if still wet. The writing began in the familiar cadence of scripture, but soon twisted into something else, a chronicle, a warning. It spoke of the 13th bell, the one never hung in any tower, cast from metal that remembered every death it had ever marked. It said the bell had been buried beneath the city during the plague, sealed by prayer and silence, for its sound did not mourn the dead, it called them. As he read, the letters began to move. The ink crawled like veins across the paper, spreading to the margins, forming shapes that pulsed in rhythm with his breath. The air thickened. The pages turned themselves. The final line glowed faintly through the blur of words. When the bells forget the living, the earth will give back the voices it kept. A sound rose from beneath the chapel floor, deep and slow, like a drumbeat inside the stone. Calder dropped the manuscript and stumbled back, whispering a prayer that came out as smoke. The floor trembled once, then split. When the others found the church the next morning, the altar was shattered, the floor gaping open into darkness. The manuscript was gone, but the air still smelled of ink and fire. On the wall above the pulpit, written in a hand not human, one new line gleamed faintly in soot. The bells remember everything. The journal was found days later, or what the frightened survivors still called days, in a puddle near the Royal Mile. The ink had run, the pages swollen by fog, but enough remained to tell the end of the city's watch. It belonged to Sergeant Andrew Keir, one of the last men tasked with keeping order in a place that had forgotten how to tell morning from night. The entries stopped abruptly after the 30th of October, the very hour the bells began to toll on their own. But the final pages told a story no one could mistake. The first entry was ordinary enough, patrol quiet, fog heavy. Heard something like hammering beneath the bridge, ordered men to check the vaults, returned with nothing. The next, written a few hours later, had grown uneven. The sound again, not hammering breathing, like the city's got lungs. Men uneasy. Fraser gone since Tuesday. Smoke thicker every hour. Smells like wax and iron. By the next page, his script was jagged, almost carved into the paper. Bells ringing without wind, doors shaking in their frames, saw a light under the ground through the cracks, red as the forge. Then, the cobbler found burned, boot prints in the wood too deep for any man. All bells now ringing together, men bleeding from ears. Can't tell if we're above or below anymore. The last entry was dated the night before silence fell. The handwriting was almost illegible, but the words that could be read chilled even the clergy who examined them. 31 souls still standing in the watch. Each bell answers another. We gathered at the foot of the bridge. The fog moves like water. Something stirs beneath it, can hear names in the ringing our own, over and over. Ordered men to retreat to the toll booth. No answer. Every sound bends. Thought I saw Fraser walking out of the smoke. He smiled, but mouth wrong way round. Said we're already inside. Going to write the names, so they're remembered. Below that line, 31 names had been written, one beneath the next. Each was crossed out in thick black strokes. The ink had eaten through the paper, as though it had burned its way out. When the journal was found, the fog had lifted briefly enough for a few to climb the bridge. What they found there stopped them from going farther. The paving stones were cracked and blackened. Along the parapet, in a long, uneven line, 31 dark stains marked the stone oval, human-sized, baked into the surface, as if pressed there by immense heat. The air smelled faintly of candle tallow. That night, the fog returned thicker than before. Those who dared stay awake claimed to hear footsteps crossing the bridge, slow and heavy, accompanied by the faint rustle of paper. And sometimes, just before the fog swallowed the sound entirely, they heard the clink of a bell rope swinging without hands. Long after the watch disappeared, the city fell into a hush so deep it seemed carved from the air itself. The fog had congealed into a permanent twilight, neither night nor day, only a dim amber glow that flickered faintly like the inside of an old lamp. People spoke now only in whispers. The sound of their own breath frightened them. But it was during this stillness that a rumour began. A new bell tower had appeared in Edinburgh. A milkmaid was the first to see it, or so she swore. She had climbed Arthur's Seat before dawn to escape the suffocating air below. When the fog shifted, she saw the city stretched beneath her, and rising from its heart, a spire she did not remember. It stood black against the haze, taller than street Giles, slender as a needle. She watched its surface glimmer faintly, as though slick with rain or blood. Then, in a single blink, it vanished back into the mist. By midday, others had seen it too. A sailor from Leith claimed it stood where the toll booth once was. A widow near Greyfriars swore she saw it in the reflection of her wash basin, though when she turned, the space behind her was empty. Each description differed slightly: the number of windows, the colour of its stone, but all agreed on one thing: the tower had no door. A small party of scholars from the university gathered to investigate, led by Dr. Patrick Ellison, a man who believed even curses must follow laws of nature. They brought lanterns, measuring tools, and holy water for the sake of caution. As they approached the Royal Mile, the fog thickened until their lights barely reached their boots. Still, they walked on. The air grew warmer with every step, humming faintly like the inside of a bell. And then they saw it. The 13th tower loomed before them, smooth, seamless, and black as iron. No mortar, no seams, no markings but one. The circle crossed by 3 lines, etched deep into the metal surface. The scholars stood transfixed. The tower seemed to vibrate, not from wind, but from sound, a note so low it trembled in their bones. Ellison stepped forward first. He touched the mark with the tip of his cane. The metal was hot. Beneath the hum came a faint rhythm, like a pulse. "It's hollow," he whispered. "Something's inside." Before anyone could stop him, he pressed his ear to the surface, his face drained of colour. "It's ringing," he said softly. "Not outside, inside." The fog thickened again. The lanterns flickered. One by one, the scholars turned toward the sound that now filled the street, a faint, high chime from somewhere far above, clear as crystal. They looked up. The tower had no top. It stretched endlessly into the fog, its upper half fading into nothing. The chime came again, closer now, almost gentle. When the fog cleared an hour later, the tower was gone. Only Ellison's cane remained, its wood scorched black and warm to the touch. And that night, when the bells resumed their endless tolling, one new note joined them, high, thin, and far too pure to belong to any bell made by human hands. When the 13th tower vanished, the city thought the nightmare had reached its peak, but the fog did not lift. It only deepened, growing heavy and low, settling into the winds like smoke from 1,000 unseen fires. From this new darkness came a woman, or something that wore the shape of one. She was first seen at the foot of Grassmarket just before dawn, walking slowly through the mist, her skirts whispering against the cobbles. Those who saw her said her gown was black, not the dull black of mourning cloth, but the kind that swallowed light entirely, the way ink devours water. A veil covered her face, and yet her eyes were visible beneath it, glowing faintly like coals in a dying hearth. Wherever she passed, the sound of faint bells followed her 3 notes only, soft, mournful, always the same. No one knew her name. She appeared without announcement at the funerals of those lost to the fog, standing at the edge of every burial ground with hands folded neatly before her. She never spoke, never wept, never moved until the last spade of dirt struck the coffin lid. Then she would bow once and vanish into the mist. Some called her a ghost, others whispered she was death herself, taking inventory of what the bells had claimed. But not everyone buried that week had died naturally. When the smoke began to rise from beneath the vaults again, strange deaths followed. People found standing upright, their faces serene, their skin faintly warm as though caught mid-prayer. Each of them was found with a small black ribbon tied around one wrist, and each funeral the widow attended. One evening, a doctor named Samuel Craig resolved to confront her. He followed her from the kirkyard to the old wynd below the castle, where she seemed to drift more than walk. "Madam," he called. "What are you?" His voice cracked, but she stopped. Slowly, she turned her veiled head toward him. He stepped closer, emboldened by his own fear. "If you mourn, tell us whom you mourn for." Her voice, when it came, was not a voice at all, but a harmony of tones, like many people speaking the same word through a hollow pipe. "All of you." Craig stumbled back. The air grew hot. The widow lifted one hand and touched the veil. For a moment, he saw what lay beneath it. Not a face, but a smooth, shining surface, as if her head were made of polished obsidian. Reflected in it, he saw himself, and behind him, the faint outline of the 13th tower rising once more from the fog. When he blinked, she was gone. Only a faint scent lingered, ashes and lilies. At dawn, the doctor's body was found at the gates of the kirkyard, standing upright, eyes open, lips faintly curved as if in peace. Around his wrist was tied a ribbon of black silk, the knot impossibly tight, and though the air was still, his coat sleeve moved softly, as if stirred by a breeze that no one else could feel. When the widow appeared at funerals that no one had arranged, the people began whispering of something older than death stirring beneath Edinburgh. The vaults under the bridges had always been uneasy ground, a honeycomb of forgotten rooms where the air stayed damp even in summer. But now, the dampness had turned warm. The stones sweated, the fog seemed to sink through cracks in the street and never return. It was the gravediggers who felt it first. Their shovels struck not soil but iron, a hollow ring that sent a vibration through the earth. Beneath Greyfriars, the dead had started rising in strange ways, not from their graves but from below them. Wooden coffins buckled upward as though something were pressing from the other side. One morning, a grave burst open in silence, spilling not bones but a fine black dust that glittered like powdered coal. When the bell of St. Giles sounded again only once, a single deep note, the vibration spread through the ground. Cracks opened along the Royal Mile. Smoke seeped through them, not from fire, but from heat, as if the city's core had awakened. The smell of wax filled the air. 3 men from the university went down into the vaults that night to see what lay beneath. They carried lanterns, ropes, and salt. One was a geologist, one a surgeon, and the third a historian named Dunlop, who believed in omens but hid it behind his spectacles. They found the lowest archway near the cowgate half collapsed, yet warm to the touch. Behind it was a stair they swore had not existed before, spiraling downward, made of stone slick as glass. They descended. The air grew thicker, almost liquid. The sound of dripping water followed them. But when they raised their lamps, they saw no moisture, only walls that shimmered faintly with a red glow. pulsing in rhythm with something unseen. Dunlop said it reminded him of a heartbeat. The surgeon laughed uneasily. "Then we are in its throat," he said. At the bottom of the stair they reached, a chamber the size of a cathedral. The ceiling vanished into shadow, the floor littered with rusted chains and fragments of what looked like bell, metal, warped, melted, reformed. In the center stood a shape rising from the stone, massive and round, its surface smooth, except where runes had been carved deep and blackened by time. "A casting pit," whispered the geologist, but even he didn't believe it. When the surgeon touched the metal, the chamber breathed, the lamps flickered, and a sound filled the space, not a bell this time, but the echo of one. The notes swelled until the air trembled, pressing against their lungs. The walls began to move, contracting slightly, then expanding, as though the city itself had drawn a breath. The geologist screamed for the rope. Dunlop stumbled, clutching the journal that held their sketches. He looked up once more before the lamps went out. The great bell in the center was not made of iron, it was made of bone. When the vaults were searched days later, only the journal remained. Its final line, scrawled by a trembling hand, read, "The city does not sit upon the earth, it is the shell of something still alive." In the weeks after the vault explorers vanished, Edinburgh learned a new kind of silence, one that was not the absence of sound, but its echo stretched too thin to die. The bells no longer rang in any tower, yet their tone lingered everywhere, in the walls, in the cobbles, in the hollow of a wineglass when touched. The city had become an instrument that would not stop humming. At first it was faint, almost ignorable. The hum lived in the floorboards, vibrating plates on the table, making candles flicker in rhythm, but soon it grew louder, until even breathing seemed to keep time with it. Those who stayed long enough began to change. They spoke more softly, as if not to disturb the unseen rhythm. Their footsteps synchronized, their hearts beat in time. No one could remember the pitch precisely, it seemed different to every ear, but all agreed on its shape. The sound of metal cooling, of air trapped inside stone. The university bell tower was the first to collapse. It happened without warning one night, a low groan followed by a rush of dust that swallowed the courtyard. Students searching the rubble found no bodies, only the tower's great bell split perfectly down the middle, its edges glowing faintly as though freshly cast. When touched, it gave off the faint vibration of a living pulse. After that, the hum deepened. Doors shook, windows quivered in their frames, the air itself seemed to throb, each vibration stronger than the last. The city's cats vanished first, then its birds. People began to wake with nosebleeds, their dreams full of long corridors that curved inward like the inside of an ear. In the kirk at Canongate, the last priest still standing tried to drown the hum with hymns. He gathered his flock and ordered them to sing louder, to fill the space with sound until the vibration broke. But their voices turned thin and sharp, every note bending upward into the same single pitch, the same impossible resonance that trembled through the stone. One by one, they stopped singing and pressed their palms to their throats. Outside, the fog began to shimmer. It pulsed gently, swelling and contracting as though listening. The hum grew higher until the air itself seemed to glow. Then came the stillness, too complete, too sudden. The priest thought for a moment they had broken it, but when he turned toward the altar, he saw the candles leaning inward, their flames stretching toward the floor. The sound returned all at once, no longer a hum but a roar so deep it vibrated the marrow of every living thing. The walls rippled. The bell tower that had stood for centuries folded like cloth. When the noise finally eased, the kirk was empty. Only the hymn book remained open on the pulpit, its pages trembling in the air that would not still. The faint tone continued, soft now, endless, threading through every stone of the city, proof that nothing had truly stopped, only slowed to the rhythm of something vast still breathing beneath Edinburgh. Even now, when fog lies thickest on the Royal Mile, the stones themselves are said to murmur. If you press your ear to the ground, you can hear it, the city still singing its own requiem, a sound that never fades. The last written account of the Edinburgh bells came not from a priest or a watchman, but from a scholar, a historian named Margaret Ainslie, once of the university, later called the chronicler of the dead city. She had remained behind when the others fled north, determined to document the truth before it vanished beneath rumour. She carried with her the surviving pages of Sergeant Keir's journal, a fragment of Reverend Bellamy's sermon, and a small brass tuning fork she claimed could still sing the key of the bells. Her lodgings overlooked the crumbled spire of Street Giles. From there she recorded everything that happened in the final days, the fog's return, the constant vibration in the walls, the slow unmaking of the city's shape. Her diary, discovered years later in the ruins, began calmly. The hum persists, low and patient. The air moves in time with it. The buildings lean imperceptibly, as though drawn toward a center below the streets. I believe we are being folded inward, like parchment burned from the edges. She wrote of seeing the 13th tower again, not standing now, but descending, sinking into the cobbles like a nail pressed into wood. The stones swallow it willingly, she noted. It leaves behind no shadow, only heat. At night, she wandered the Royal Mile with her tuning fork. When she struck it against the railings, the air shimmered, the hum beneath the street responding like a second voice. The tone was perfect, pure, almost beautiful, until she realized it was harmonizing with her heartbeat. The final entries grow erratic. Her penmanship twists and sharpens, as if written in haste. The bells are not calling the dead, they are calling memory itself. Every toll is a wound reopened, every echo another breath drawn by the city beneath. I have seen the mark again, the circle, and the 3 lines carved into my own window pane from the inside. She described how the vibration began to climb higher, becoming almost musical. The air thickened with it, heavy as syrup. The houses creaked and shifted, their angles wrong, their proportions subtly bending. The streets are shorter each night, she wrote. I walk a mile and end where I began. We are being turned inside out. The last page is half burned, the ink blistered. What can still be read is this: they were never meant to be bells, they are lungs. The city breathes through them when the silence grows too deep. The hum is its blood moving. It is alive, and it remembers who woke it. Below that line, written faintly in soot rather than ink, was a single sentence that no scholar could explain. When the bells ring again, do not listen, because it will not be the city remembering you. It will be you remembering it. No one ever found her body. Only the tuning fork remained on her desk, still vibrating softly, though no one had touched it in years. Its note has never stopped. Years passed, or what men called years, though the sky above Edinburgh never truly changed. The fog remained, silver and soft, veiling the city in a light that was neither morning nor night. The air had gone still, too still, and those who wandered back to the ruins said they could hear their own thoughts echoing through the stones. The hum had faded to a whisper. The streets lay quiet. For a while, it seemed the city had finally gone to sleep. Then, one autumn dusk, the first bell stirred again. It came not from any steeple, but from the earth itself. A deep note, low and slow, blooming from beneath the cobbles like breath from a buried throat. Dust fell from the eaves, pigeons rose in silence, and the air turned warm, warmer than it had been in years. The second bell followed, higher this time, its echo sliding through the winds like water through veins. Windows shuddered, old glass fractured in elegant lines, like frost forming in reverse. Those few who still lived near the edge of the city swore they saw light moving through the fog, an amber glow rising and falling in perfect rhythm with the sound. It came from the Royal Mile, pulsing upward, spreading across the skyline. And with it came another sound, footsteps, hundreds of them walking together, steady and calm. From beneath the stones of Street Giles, the great doors pushed open of their own accord. No one saw who entered or who left, only the fog spilling outward, curling into the shapes of people, translucent, soundless, eyes open but unseeing. They moved slowly, each carrying something faint in their hands. a black ribbon knotted into a loop. On the castle hill, the bell tower that had long stood silent began to move, not sway, not crumble, but grow. The stones stretched upward like saplings in spring, rising beyond the fog, black against the lightless sky. Each time the bells tolled, the tower lengthened, its surface gleaming wet as molten metal. By the seventh toll, the earth trembled. By the ninth, the streets began to sing. The hum that had once haunted the stones returned stronger, layered with voices, men, women, children, all speaking at once in the same long, drawn-out tone. The sound rolled across the firth, carrying as far as Leith and the surrounding fields. Farmers who heard it said their animals knelt. The sea itself seemed to bow, and then came the final bell, the 13th. It struck once, clear as glass breaking, and for a moment the world held still. Every echo folded into itself, leaving a single vibration that trembled in the chest of every living thing. Then silence fell, pure, absolute, heavier than sound. When the fog cleared, Edinburgh stood empty again. No birds, no footsteps, only the faint shimmer of air above the stones, as though the city had exhaled and was waiting to draw breath once more. And if you stand there now, in the quiet between gusts, you can still feel it, the heartbeat beneath the cobbles, faint but steady. The bells never stopped. They are only waiting for someone to listen again.